The cabin of United Airlines Flight 1313 is exactly 37 minutes into its journey from Chicago O'Hare to Seattle Tacoma when the screaming starts. Not the polite, muffled kind of arguing that flight attendants are trained to de-escalate with a practiced smile and a tiny bottle of water. This is something rawer, something that cuts right through the steady white noise of twin CFM56 turbofan engines humming at cruising altitude, through the rustle of overhead air vents, through the collective distracted fog of 287 passengers settling into the particular private world that long-haul flying creates. This is the sound of a child in distress. And it is getting worse. The Boeing 737-900ER, tail number N37513, departed gate H14 at 11:42 a.m. on a Tuesday in late October. The sky over Lake Michigan was the color of old pewter. The aircraft climbed through 18,000 feet of cloud cover before breaking into the kind of impossible high-altitude blue that makes you briefly forget every problem you have ever had. For most of the 287 souls aboard, this would be a routine 3-hour and 40-minute flight. A business trip, a holiday visit, a connection to somewhere else. Nothing special, nothing memorable. For one 12-year-old boy sitting in seat 14C, it would be the most terrifying flight of his life. His name is Daniel. He has close-cropped brown hair and his father's careful eyes. He is wearing noise-canceling headphones because the world, for Daniel, arrives with a particular kind of overwhelming sharpness that most people are never required to negotiate. He is profoundly deaf. He reads lips with startling precision. He communicates in American Sign Language with a fluency that his teachers call extraordinary. He is also a type 1 diabetic, diagnosed at age 7, which means his body is running a constant silent negotiation with glucose levels that can turn dangerous with almost no warning at all. In the seat pocket directly in front of him is a small zippered medical pouch. Inside that pouch is his insulin pen, his glucose monitor, his fast-acting sugar tablets, and a laminated medical card that explains all of this in clear, unambiguous language to any adult who might need to understand the situation quickly. That pouch is no longer in the seat pocket. And 37 minutes into Flight 1313, Daniel's continuous glucose monitor is vibrating against his wrist with the particular urgent pattern that means his blood sugar is dropping fast. His father is in seat 14A, across the aisle. His father is currently in the forward galley speaking urgently to 2 flight attendants. His father's face is the color of chalk. In seat 15B, directly behind Daniel, a woman named Deborah Whitmore is telling the flight attendant nearest to her that she did what she did because she had every right to, and that if anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with her attorney. Nobody on this airplane yet knows who Daniel's father is. But they are about to find out. And when they do, every single thing about the next 2 hours and 11 minutes is going to change. Keep watching, because this story is unlike anything that has ever happened at 35,000 feet. To understand how Flight 1313 arrived at this particular moment of crisis, you need to go back approximately 19 hours, to a Tuesday morning in the kind of upper-middle-class Chicago suburb where the houses have 3-car garages and the HOA newsletter is updated weekly. Deborah Whitmore, known to her neighbors and her estranged book club members and the management teams of no fewer than 7 airline customer service departments as simply Karen, was already angry before she got out of bed. Deborah was 51 years old. She had the bearing of a woman who had once been told she was exceptional and had spent the subsequent 3 decades trying to collect enough evidence to prove it. She wore her blonde highlights maintained by a colorist she tipped poorly and spoke about dismissively. She carried a designer carry-on that she had purchased specifically because its dimensions were just barely over the airline's size limit, and she had never once been asked to check it, which she interpreted as confirmation that the rules were suggestions designed for other people. Her travel history read like a rap sheet of entitled behavior. In the past 4 years alone, she had filed 23 formal complaints with United Airlines, 7 with American, and an even dozen with Southwest. The complaints followed a pattern. Seat assignments she found beneath her dignity, flight attendants she described as incompetent, delays she attributed to personal malice, upgrades she believed she deserved and had not received. She had screamed at a gate agent in Dallas over a middle seat. She had demanded a first-class passenger be removed from his seat in Phoenix because she had, in her words, been a United customer for longer. She had posted videos of herself confronting flight crews on social media, framing each incident as herself bravely holding corporations accountable. She had never once been placed on a no-fly list. She had never faced any consequence more serious than a voucher and an apology. This had confirmed for Deborah what she had long suspected. She was untouchable. On the morning of Flight 1313, she arrived at O'Hare 2 hours before departure with her carry-on, her oversized purse that functioned as a second carry-on, and the specific energy of someone looking for a fight before breakfast. She had booked seat 15B, which is an aisle seat in the main cabin of a 737-900, excellent legroom, easy access. She had wanted an exit row but had been unwilling to pay the upgrade fee, a fact she had already decided to contest at the gate. The gate agent at H14, a young woman named Priya, handled Deborah's upgrade request with the careful professionalism of someone trained to de-escalate while internally running a mental countdown to their next break. There were no complimentary exit row seats available. Priya explained this 3 times using 3 different phrasings. Deborah demanded a supervisor. The supervisor arrived, confirmed what Priya had said, and offered Deborah a $75 travel voucher as a goodwill gesture. Deborah accepted the voucher, accused Priya of having an attitude, and wheeled her oversized carry-on toward the jetway with the air of someone who had won something. She had not won anything, but she felt that she had, and that feeling was going to metastasize into something ugly at 35,000 feet. She noticed Daniel and his father during boarding. They were in row 14, 1 row ahead of her, which placed Daniel's headrest directly within her line of sight and, more importantly, directly within her sphere of grievance. Daniel boarded wearing his headphones, holding his father's hand, moving through the cabin with the particular focused attention of a child who has learned to navigate the overwhelming sensory complexity of airports and aircraft. His father, a tall man in his early 40s with a quiet, contained quality to his movements, settled Daniel into 14C before stowing their shared overhead bag with practiced efficiency. The father's name is Captain Marcus Webb, but Deborah does not know this yet. She sees a man in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray quarter-zip pullover, and makes an immediate, reflexive assessment. She sees no business class ticket. She sees a deaf child with medical equipment. She sees people she has decided are not important. The flight attendant who introduces herself to the passengers in rows 12 through 18 is named Keisha. She is a 15-year veteran of United Airlines who has worked international routes, medical emergencies, emergency evacuations, and one unforgettable transatlantic crossing during which she helped deliver a premature infant over the North Atlantic. She is not easily rattled. But something about the woman in 15B sets off a quiet professional alarm. Keisha notices Deborah's carry-on, which she asks to measure. Deborah resists. Keisha persists professionally. The bag is placed in the overhead bin through what Deborah describes loudly as unnecessary harassment. Keisha notices Deborah craning her neck to look at Daniel, studying the medical pouch in the seat pocket with an expression that Keisha will later describe to investigators as calculating. Before the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Deborah had already complained to Keisha about the overhead bin space, the temperature in the cabin, the fact that a child was seated near her, and the specific angle at which the window shade in row 14 was positioned. Each complaint was delivered with a particular emphasis, the emphasis of someone establishing dominance, marking territory, making sure everyone in earshot understood that she was a passenger who required managing and that this managing would be done on her terms. Captain Marcus Webb in 14A heard none of this through his earbuds. He was reviewing weather data on his tablet, tracking the upper-level wind patterns that would affect their crossing over the Rockies. When Marcus Webb is not in seat 14A of a United 737-900 in civilian clothes accompanying his son to a medical specialist in Seattle, he is in the cockpit of a wide-body aircraft wearing 4 stripes on his shoulder. He has 9,400 flight hours. He holds an ATP certificate, a medical examiner designation, and has served for 3 years on the FAA's Aviation Safety Hotline Advisory Board. He knows more about the aircraft he is currently sitting in as a passenger than most people ever will about anything. He is also, quietly and without performance, the kind of father who learned American Sign Language before Daniel was 2 years old, who rearranged his entire bid schedule to make this specialist appointment in Seattle, who packed Daniel's medical bag himself that morning, triple-checking every item with the checklist precision of a professional aviator. The last thing he checked before zipping the pouch was the insulin pen. He placed it in the seat pocket of 14C before the door closed. The aircraft pushed back at 11:38 a.m. The crew completed their safety demonstration. The 737 taxied to runway 10R and rotated into the gray Chicago morning. 37 minutes later, at approximately 12:19 p.m., at an altitude of 35,000 feet over central Wisconsin, Deborah Whitmore reached forward into the seat pocket in front of her, which was the seat pocket of row 14, which was Daniel's seat pocket, and removed the medical pouch. What happened in the next 4 minutes happens the way disasters always happen at altitude. In a confined metal tube moving at 530 miles per hour, with no exits, no escape routes, no possibility of simply walking away. Daniel felt it first. His CGM, the continuous glucose monitor on his wrist, shifted from its yellow caution pattern to the red urgent pattern that his father had spent years training him to recognize as an immediate call to action. His blood glucose was dropping. He needed his glucose tablets. He needed them now. He reached into the seat pocket. His fingers found only the airline magazine and the laminated safety card. He looked at his father. Marcus was watching him with the constant low-level attention that parents of type 1 diabetic children develop like a sixth sense. He saw Daniel's expression. He saw the empty seat pocket. He was out of his seat in under 3 seconds, which is very fast for a man who also managed to grab the call button on his way up. Keisha arrived from the forward galley within 45 seconds of the call. By this point, Marcus had checked under Daniel's seat, in the overhead bin in the adjacent row pockets. He had arrived at the only conclusion available and was standing very still with the particular stillness of a man exercising exceptional self-control. Marcus communicated with Keisha in a rapid, controlled murmur. His son's medical pouch was missing. His son was experiencing a dropping glucose event. He needed the emergency medical kit from the forward galley immediately, and he needed to know if any passenger near their row had touched anything in row 14's seat pocket. Keisha moved. And that is when Deborah Whitmore made the single greatest mistake of her life. She spoke. She said, loudly enough for rows 12 through 18 to hear her clearly, that the child's medical bag had been in her personal space and she had moved it because she was entitled to a clutter-free seat environment, and that if the father had a problem with that, he should have booked a medical transport and not inconvenienced paying customers with his child's special needs situation. The cabin went very quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of passengers absorbed in their screens and sleep masks. The particular charged quiet of nearly 300 people recalibrating simultaneously. Marcus turned. He looked at Deborah with an expression that several passengers would later describe to journalists as the most controlled display of contained fury they had ever witnessed in another human being. He asked, in a voice so quiet it required complete silence to hear, where his son's medical bag was. Deborah told him she had placed it in the overhead bin 2 rows back because it had been in her way. Marcus moved to the overhead bin. The bag was not there. He checked the adjacent bin. He checked the bin across the aisle. The bag was not in any overhead bin within 5 rows. He turned back to Deborah. He asked her again where the bag was. She told him she didn't actually remember exactly where she had put it, and that he needed to lower his voice. And that is when Daniel, from seat 14C, began to look pale in the specific way that Marcus Webb recognized from 7 years of parenting a type 1 diabetic child as the early signs of a hypoglycemic episode progressing towards serious danger. Stay right here, because everything that happens in the next 90 minutes is going to rewrite everything this woman thought she knew about consequence. Keisha was already on the forward galley phone to the cockpit when she heard Deborah's declaration. The call had been professional. Medical situation developing in row 14, possible passenger interference with patient medication. The voice that came back to her on the interphone was the voice of Captain David Okafor, the operating pilot of Flight 1313, who had been flying the left seat of Boeing aircraft for 22 years and who responded to the words possible passenger interference with patient medication, with the particular calmness of someone for whom calmness is not the opposite of urgency but its most effective form. Captain Okafor asked Keisha to confirm the nature of the medical situation. She confirmed, 12-year-old male, type 1 diabetic, blood glucose dropping, medication inaccessible. He asked if she needed him to declare a medical emergency and divert. She told him she would advise within 5 minutes. She then walked back to row 14 with the emergency medical kit. The passengers in rows 10 through 20 were now operating as a unified, extremely attentive audience. A retired ER nurse in seat 11D had already left her seat and was moving toward row 14, identifying herself to Keisha quietly. A man in 16A had his phone out and was filming. A woman in 13B had already located a packet of orange juice from her personal bag and was holding it ready in case it was needed. These are people who understand that something real is happening. Deborah Whitmore, in 15B, was telling the passenger in 15C that the father was being extremely dramatic and that she had every right to a neat seat environment and that the airline should never have allowed a child with medical equipment to sit in front of her. The passenger in 15C, a retired schoolteacher from Tacoma named Beverly, looked at Deborah with an expression that communicated volumes and then pointedly turned to face forward. The retired ER nurse helped Keisha access the emergency medical kit, which aboard a 737-900 includes a glucose testing kit and glucose solution but does not include a compatible insulin pen for Daniel's specific prescription dosage. The most important item in Daniel's own medical pouch in this moment was not the insulin itself. His glucose was dropping, not rising, which meant the immediate crisis was about low blood sugar. It was the fast-acting glucose tablets that Daniel's endocrinologist had prescribed specifically for episodes like this one. Without them, the protocol was 4 dextrose from the emergency kit, which the ER nurse was prepared to administer but which Daniel, who had received it once before, found extremely distressing. Marcus was signing to Daniel. His hands moved in the rapid, precise vocabulary of a father and son who have spent 12 years communicating in the same language. He was telling Daniel what was happening. He was telling Daniel that he was going to be fine. He was watching his son's color and counting seconds. And then a 12-year-old girl in seat 17A, who had been watching everything with enormous eyes above the seat back, tugged her mother's sleeve and whispered something. Her mother stood up immediately. "I think I saw where she put it," the mother said. Her name was Christine Park, and she was traveling with her daughter Eva from a school trip to Chicago back to their home in Bellevue. Eva saw the woman from 15B put a bag under the seat. "I think she put it under 15A. Keisha moved to 15A, which was currently occupied by a man who had been asleep since before takeoff and who woke to find a flight attendant reaching under his seat with professional urgency. The medical pouch was there. It had been pushed all the way to the back where it was invisible from the aisle. The glucose tablets were inside. Keisha had them in Marcus's hands in under 30 seconds. Marcus had them to Daniel in under 5 seconds after that. The cabin exhaled. But the moment of relief lasted approximately 45 seconds before it became something else entirely. Because Marcus Webb straightened up from his son's seat, turned around to face Deborah Whitmore, and the expression on his face was no longer just a father's terror and relief. It was something with more depth than that. Something that had added a second layer on top of the first. He said very quietly, "You hid a sick child's medical supplies," Deborah said loudly. "I moved an item that was in my personal area. I've done nothing wrong. I want to speak to the pilot." The woman in 13B said, under her breath but not quietly enough, "Oh my God." And then, from the interphone above the forward galley, Captain David Okafor's voice came through the cabin speakers in the tone of formal announcement that requires everyone aboard an aircraft to stop everything and listen. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We have an ongoing medical situation aboard the aircraft. I'm going to ask all passengers to remain in their seats with seatbelts fastened. I want to advise the cabin that under FAA Federal Aviation Regulation 91.11, any interference with the safety of an aircraft or its passengers, including interference with medical treatment or medical supplies, constitutes a federal offense. We have 2 air marshals aboard this flight who are now active. Anyone found to have interfered with a passenger's medical treatment will be met by federal authorities upon landing. That is all." The cabin was so quiet after this that you could hear the particular high harmonic of the engines at altitude. You could hear Deborah Whitmore say, in a voice from which all certainty had very suddenly departed, "Air marshals." And from seats 9C and 22D, Two people who had been sitting in perfect, unremarkable stillness since before takeoff stood up at the same time. This is the part nobody saw coming. Federal Air Marshal Thomas Reyes, badge number out of the Chicago field office, had been in seat 9C since the gate. He had assessed every passenger during boarding, as he always did, and he had flagged the woman in 15B during the boarding process as a behavioral watch, which was a professional designation that meant exactly what it sounded like. He had observed the bag removal through the gap between the seats. He had been in quiet radio contact with the cockpit and with his partner in 22D since 3 minutes after takeoff. He moved to row 15 with the particular quality of movement that belongs to people whose authority requires no announcement. His partner, Marshal Sandra Choi, moved from 22D to block the rear aisle. They were a bracket. Deborah Whitmore was what the bracket contained. Marshal Reyes identified himself in a voice that was not loud but was completely, absolutely clear. He told Deborah that she was being detained. He told her that she should not reach for any of her belongings or attempt to stand. He told her that there would be a formal statement process beginning immediately. Deborah said she wanted to call her attorney. Marshal Reyes told her that she was on an aircraft at 35,000 feet and that her attorney was not available. The passenger in 15C, Beverly the retired schoolteacher, pressed herself as close to the window as her seat would allow, which is a thing that people do when they suddenly realize that the situation they are adjacent to is significantly more serious than they understood. And then Marcus Webb did the thing that nobody on this aircraft was prepared for. He reached into the pocket of his quarter-zip pullover and he produced a credentials wallet. He opened it. He showed it first to Marshal Reyes, who looked at it and then looked at Marcus with the particular recalibration of someone encountering something they were not expecting. He then held it at a level where the passengers in the surrounding rows could see it, not for drama, not for performance, but because he needed what it represented to be part of the formal record of what had happened on this aircraft. The wallet contained his FAA identification, his airline transport pilot certificate, and a card identifying him as an active member of the FAA Aviation Safety Hotline Advisory Board, a position that comes with a specific class of federal designation that means, in practical terms, that an attack on his son's medical treatment on a commercial aircraft is not merely a passenger altercation. It is an attack adjacent to federal aviation safety infrastructure. It triggers a specific reporting protocol. It lands in a specific jurisdiction. Keisha, standing at the forward galley door, later said that the sound Deborah Whitmore made when she saw those credentials was unlike anything she had heard in 15 years of aviation. It was the sound of someone realizing all at once the full weight of where they were. Not on a sidewalk, not in a store, not in a restaurant where you could leave, where there were exits, where the person you had decided to target could just be a stranger you'd never see again. They were in a sealed metal tube at 35,000 feet over the American Midwest. There was nowhere to go. There was no undoing what she had done. And the man she had targeted, the man whose deaf diabetic child's insulin she had hidden under a seat, the man she had dismissed because he was wearing jeans and a pullover and didn't look important enough to matter, that man had Federal Aviation Authority credentials and had just made sure every person in earshot understood exactly what that meant. The interphone conversation between Captain Okafor and Marcus Webb lasted 6 minutes. The passengers within earshot of row 14 could hear Marcus's side of it. Measured, precise, the voice of a professional reporting an incident through official channels. Not the voice of an angry father, though he was also that. He used specific regulatory language. He referenced specific FAR sections. He provided his FAA identification number from memory. He said once, with a control that cost him something visible, "My son is stable. I want to make sure this is documented correctly, so it never happens to another family." Captain Okafor made a second PA announcement. He advised passengers